press the record button. Right. Share screen. Well, yet again, we have another excellent interviewee to this Mad Cat collection in lockdown. Howard Evans, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Good evening. Thank you.
I know a little bit about you, but I remember, I think my first occasion was when we were a band. We were just beginning to blow through Miracles of Grace, and we ended up at Butlins, which we always did every year. And I think you were a guest one year, and I said, "Did you like Miracles of Grace?" And yes.
Yeah, I did. It's actually I can't remember when I wrote it. All I know,
it was published in 1989. But,
right.
I think you said it was. My memory said it was a film on the request of Ray Bowes.
Yeah, it was something that I was asked for, and actually, it's really interesting because writing something for the Unity series and writing something that's within that kind of sort of format, and writing something that's really well crafted is probably one of the hardest things to do. In a way, it's actually often easier, to have the full shebang going with a festival series score, where you've got so many more options. But sometimes if you're trying to reduce a scoring on something like that and you're reducing to 3 parts, it's a bit like string quartet writing. There's an art to string quartet writing, as opposed to the kind of sort of symphonic writing, and just the way you make it work. And I did actually enjoy doing that piece, and I have it has been used on a few occasions, and I have actually sort of quite enjoyed going back to it in that way, but it's a long time since I did that. So that would have been when I was the national bandmaster. I became the national bandmaster as a very young Salvation Army captain in 1988. My wife and we became officers in 1984, and we moved up kind of out of turn in about, I think it was it was actually the beginning of April. We moved up from Cornwall up to London for me to take on the responsibility of the national bandmaster role. So that's quite a long time ago now.
So where did it begin? Are you from a musical family? What's your musical heritage? Is there one?
Yes, there is. Few people will possibly have heard me kind of say this before, but the musical stuff, there's always been music in the family. Army-wise, it goes back quite a long way. My grandfather was actually in the Torchbearers session and was one of the original musical troopers in 1933, one of the B-flat bass players, when there's a photograph of them at Clapton Congress Hall, and he's one of the B-flat bass players in there. They marched around East Anglia for 3 to 4 months.
This is in Alford. We have a photo in the Corps Archives.
Yep, 3 to 4 months, and did all sorts of things. So there's all sorts there. In fact, don't often say too much about this, but I suppose the musical heritage is there in a way, in that my grandmother was Eric Ball's cousin.
Oh,
and we lived, as a youngster, we lived next door to my grandmother, and Eric came to stay on a couple of occasions. And in fact, one of the loveliest, typical of him really, one of the loveliest stories about him in that way was that Stan and Mary Randall used to look after him quite a lot. Mm-hmm. And when I was appointed the national bandmaster, I think Mary was talking to Eric and said, about this young officer who'd been appointed as the national bandmaster. And Mary, according to Mary, Eric simply said, and you can just hear him say it in his very kindly way, "Well, of course, he's a relation of mine." So,
I never
so
had
yeah,
the pleasure of meeting him. So
yeah. So there's all sorts of kind of army background there. Family wise, my parents, I grew up in Wales. We moved to Leigh-on-Sea,
mhm.
and it was in the days when education was a little bit different. And although they'd married very young and got a young family, it was after we'd moved to Leigh-on-Sea that my parents both trained to become teachers, and both ended up becoming music teachers. And so they were kind of heavily involved in the music scene in Southend, both being heads of department at schools and being involved with the borough music. Saturday mornings, I have a brother and sister. We used to go to the music school on the local music school on a Saturday morning, where my dad did the band, my mum did the choir and taught other things as well. I learnt to play the French horn and the cello. Saturday afternoons, we'd go home, have a quick lunch, and Saturday afternoon, myself, I'm the eldest, my brother and sister, we'd drive across, or well, we'd get taken across to Chelmsford, where we had our piano lessons. So Saturdays were very much the music day.
Yeah.
And my parents simply gave us lots of opportunities. And I always say that my tutor, the tutor that they found us in those days, was a brilliant man by the name of Harold Parker. He would be known possibly to one or two older Salvationists. He actually taught for quite a number of years at the Colchester Institute, where Michael Clack was a lecturer for many years. So there's kind of all sorts of little circles there. Michael knew Harold Parker extremely well. And there are some other Salvationist folks that I knew that he taught at one time. But he was a brilliant teacher, not just a teacher of the piano, but I always say he kind of taught me to become a musician with just some of the things that he did, and some of the things that he tried to teach me to do. It wasn't just about the piano playing. There were all sorts of other skills and things that I used to have to do. So the music was kind of part of my background. At home, we had 4 pianos.
Oh, golly.
We lived, my parents still live in the house. They're still rolling around in the large house. We had 4 pianos. It was a large Victorian house with quite a number of rooms, and there was even a piano in the kitchen. So depending on who'd done their work and who'd done their practice properly, sometimes you had to practice in the kitchen. I never had to practice in the kitchen. I wanted to play the piano. It was never a chore for me to sit and practice. By the time I was 14, during my school holidays, I'd spend 5-6 hours practicing, because that's what I wanted to do. By that age, I was starting to have to learn repertoire. At that age, I was age 14, and I had the opportunity to go to a summer music school that was held in the borough, and I was able to go and join in the piano class that week. I was actually underage for it, but I'd made the commitment to learn the repertoire. There was a huge amount of repertoire to have to learn to go and do that. And it was a piano masterclass for the week with the British pianist, Sidney Harrison. And that kind of sort of drove me to kind of sort of get through the repertoire and sort of take on from there sort of everything I did. And so it was never a chore to practice. I gave up the cello because I learned the cello as well by the time I was about 16. I don't think I really practiced much at the cello. I eventually got myself a grade 6 on the cello, but the French horn and the piano was always my first love, although I did do some of my teaching diplomas on the French horn as well. My dad used to take me up to John Burden, who was the French horn professor at Trinity College of Music every so often, for me to have lessons there. So I just had all sorts of experiences. Southend Borough was an incredible place to have music experiences, the local youth orchestra, all of the stuff that was going on, lots of groups to be a part of, Essex Youth Orchestra, just so many things.
Real kaleidoscope, really.
Yeah, as well as all the army things that one did in those days. And being part of YP Band, I can remember there are a large number of corps. You've got Rayleigh, Hadley, Leigh-on-Sea, Southend, Southchurch, Shoebury, all of these corps near each other with groups, and we used to get together and do things. There was always I can remember even at Hadley Farm Colony, I can remember back to the days of It was affectionate. Well, it was properly known as the Three Band Festival, but I think we always used to refer to it as the Three Band Contest between Hadley Lee and Southend in those days. Up at the Farm Colony buildings, the old hall building is renovated and is part of a different conurbation up there these days, but I can remember going and taking part in all of those kind of things. So hugely mixed and varied music background, both kind of, you know, with my general music background and the army experiences that I had.
Just an amazing, sort of a solid foundation for, you know, whatever comes next. But so when did, with the ability to sort of do all these different instruments and the learning and the different people and opportunities, when did you become aware that you yourself was able to do composition on paper rather than having to learn the Bachs and the Beethovens and, you know, the historical great writers that we have? When did you know Evans was, you know, you could do that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I can always remember trying to write down little bits on scraps of manuscript, writing down things, and one of the things I remember doing, even I think I've actually still got some bits kind of from my university days. I mean, I obviously kind of sort of did all the traditional things that you do, Bach chorales, right, completing string quartets, trying to do, I was never very good at doing Palestrina. But I can remember doing all those kind of things as part of my studies, but I can remember kind of trying to take in by ear all sorts of things. I remember when the Staff Songsters first started, and the song that Norman Bearcroft wrote, the song that they first sang, I wasn't there at the event, but I had the LP, Jesus, the Very Thought of Thee. And I can remember listening to it quite a few times, and I think I've still got it because it wasn't published and because I wanted to play it. I can remember kind of playing it and dictating it to myself and sketching this out and writing this down for myself and taking it down dictation and just experimenting with a number of different things. And it's just a process that kind of sort of happened whereby you keep experimenting, you keep trying, you use all sorts of music skills, the whole kind of analysis of what you do. One of the things I still remember from my university studies, I grew to love, because it was one of the areas of study that I chose. I didn't know much about him at the time, but I remember studying the Sibelius Symphonies. The key symphonies that we had to study were the 6th and 7th, but we had to get to know all of them. The whole sense of the Sibelius Symphonies, their whole kind of motivic development, the whole construction of them, and also pieces like La Mer, all of those kind of influences kind of end up being part of who you are as a musician, in terms of unpicking things, so that when you're wanting to put something together, sometimes you don't always, sometimes you do consciously use those skills. You're looking for devices, you're looking for things to use, you're kind of trawling what you've got, but you're looking at all of those things that have ended up becoming part of your kind of musical instincts. And it's developing those instincts and opening up yourself to all of those things whereby your instincts are things that then you're able to kind of bring to bear on some of the things that perhaps you end up doing yourself in some way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you get some people who have a very sort of straight-lined, as we would both be familiar with, a Salvation Army background, where YP band, singing company, you know, and that would be, and maybe the local youth band, the local youth orchestra, but that would be it. So their case of their education would be very kind of polarized in some respects, because, you know, obviously you've said yourself that you were very thankful for having a wide variety of simulations and achievements and places where you could pick up all these different things. So it's the education for yourself. So later in life, when someone says, you know, can you translate this to oboe? It's not a case of, oh, I've got to go and learn the oboe. You know, you can pick and you can kind of go, oh, if someone wants you to write a cornet solo that's in a certain style that may not just be, I don't know, an Eric Ball clone, but could you write it in the style of, I know, Sousa, then it would come. So, I mean, I was looking at your, there was two things that jumped out at me from your Salvation Army published works. I didn't even realise were by you, but your first credit is "Come to the Saviour" in 1986,
Yeah.
the hymn tune arrangements,
Yeah.
which I thought was very lovely because it comes just before then before is that you do Miracles of Grace. But can you remember the first time that you heard a Salvation Army group play a piece of music that you had written? Whether it had been not necessarily, because obviously writing them is completely different to the order when they get published.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you can remember the first time a Salvation Army group played a Howard Evans piece.
Yeah, I obviously grew up in an age when sort of pre-computer music programs. So everything you wrote, you had to make sure it worked. You had to write out all the parts. Now, I remember doing "Come to the Saviour." It's it's actually the Welsh tune Jenny Jones. The tune Jenny Jones is probably more well known as a kind of air varie solo in the general kind of music band world. It's kind of quite a popular solo. But there's in the tune book at that time, there was a very old set of words, which is why it's called "Come to the Saviour." And I think the tune in the songbook in those days, I think the tune was actually called "The Harvest is Past" or something. But it was a beautiful tune. I fell in love with the tune. I'd done a number of arrangements. After I was a student, I was a student for 5 years because I did my degree and then I did 2 years postgraduate piano at the Royal Northern College of Music, obviously pursuing the piano career. But then everything went in the completely different direction, and I ended up working for Norman Bearcroft in the bands department, as it was then, for 12 months. So Norman had me writing out and arranging things for some of the things that we needed in those days. And then at the training college, because of my music stuff, the first couple of weeks that we were in quite large groups, and our first weekend away, I think it was about after a month we'd been in, our first weekend was to go and do kind of weekend campaigns somewhere. And I was in with a group of people, and Chick Ewell was the officer in charge of our group, and we wanted to take a circus style band out into the open air, like sort of sextet. So Chick asked me to arrange, and I arranged kind of 4 or 5, I think it was 4 or 5 choruses that we would be able to use, but in a kind of circus style for the open air.
Chick Ewell is a talented person in his own right, so that's interesting.
Yeah, it's
not something he would shirk from either. I've never met the guy, but
no. It was. I mean, in that way, people were very encouraging. I think. So I mean, those kind of experiences, the army experiences, are great in that sometimes you're writing things like that. You're doing something functional that you end up using straight away.
Yeah.
I wrote a march for the session.
Servants of God.
Servants of God. It's never been published.
I've got the recording. It's lovely.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I was asked to provide digital parts for it, so I put it onto Sibelius so that I could do that, and I just tidied up the scoring just a fraction. When I wrote it in the first year of the session, and but during that summer, my summer appointment was at Fordingbridge, and because I was at Fordingbridge, I got in touch with Eric Ball, and went and spent a day with Eric and took him my march to have a look at, so that he could look over it for me and tell me what he thought. And he was very kind about it. He was very generous about it. And in fact, there was a section of about 8 bars that I rescored. Harmonically, there was nothing wrong, but there was a section of about 8 bars that Eric said felt was a little bit heavy, and the texture in the cornet and horn parts, needed to kind of sort of vary a little bit. And so I've got the manuscript of it still, and you can see where I pasted the manuscript over to redo the scoring of those bits. So extremely helpful. But it kind of, the march ended up on our, we ended up doing it, it ended up on our sessional tape. So lots of things that I've written have ended up being done like that. The first published one that you mentioned, then, Come to the Saviour, I sent that up, and I'd done that, and I had a phone call from our previous corps officer, Major Malcolm Snell.
Lovely man.
Lovely man.
But, yeah.
Malcolm was a lovely man. By then, he was the corps officer representative on the International Music Council. And Malcolm just phoned me up one day just to say, I hadn't heard what it sounded like, but Malcolm phoned me up at my corps appointment to say, been to the Music Council this week, and I just wanted to say, we heard the most beautiful piece of music, and it was your arrangement, Come to the Saviour. So he actually phoned me up to tell me kind of how it had gone down, and that it was actually a kind of lovely arrangement before I'd even heard it. But in those days, when I was the national bandmaster, again, lots of things that I did, I ended up, some of the things that I did for the Albert Hall, things like my song When He Cometh. I wrote that in 1988. In December, December was always the time we weren't out, apart from doing our local course stuff. The bands department weren't out in those days going and doing specially. In December was the time to plan, get a lot of the plans ready and get music ready for the Albert Hall Festival each year.
Yeah.
And we were in London. My eldest daughter was just 1 year old, and I got quite melancholic and maudling about it, and ended up writing the song When He Cometh for the Albert Hall Festival the following June. So, of course, again, I wrote the song. I was able to go and try it out. Norman obviously was able to let me go and try it out with staff songsters. And then we took it round to the rehearsals that we had with all the mass brigades. And again, Ray Bowes was so encouraging to me. I'll never forget it. I think it was one of those occasions, if I'm right, I'm not sure that there was any applause, or it was quite gentle because of the nature of the song.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember doing it, and I stood down from the rostrum, and Ray was a lovely gentleman, very kind to me. And he was sat by the seat there as I got off the rostrum, and he just whispered to me as I walked off the rostrum. He just said, "Beautiful." He was just, I can remember that moment as if it happens now. There are just odd moments like that where people kind of encouraged you. So in that way, I've been very lucky.
So who were the other names of that era that sort of really mean that? So as you say with Ray Bowes, it was just that one word that spoke so much, because that was the name of the gentleman. Are there any other sort of Salvation Army names that spring up and that sort of encouraged you on your musical journey?
There are two other people. There are three people. Norman obviously was a huge encouragement.
Yeah.
And Norman gave me the opportunity to do loads of things that I would never have otherwise done. And we had a great partnership. He was really kind to me, and we got on really well. And I shall forever be grateful to Norman for the opportunities that he gave me. Secondly, RSA. RSA also became a great friend. The year that we moved to London for me to become the national bandmaster, what actually happened was that previously they booked this UK Congress for July 1988. So in the June, there was the usual Councils Festival, but then in the July, there was a big British Congress that had been organised. It was in the days when we were still the British territory. And what had happened, the dates had been booked and it had all been fixed. And the previous territorial commander had gone ahead with it, despite Norman saying to him, the staff songsters are away during that period on a tour of Scandinavia. Who's going to look after the music? Oh, well, it'll all, yeah. So what happened, and that's what happened. Norman was he was around for the festival that year. And in the July was the British Congress. RSA by then was retired and living at Kettering. And so what Norman did, and that's why I moved in the April, because we had to start rehearsals for everything, both events, and I needed to be involved in both of them. So it was an out of turn move. And so we moved up to London. And Norman came with us to the first couple of rehearsals. But RSA and I then travelled round to do all the rehearsals, because it was chorus for a Saturday and for the Sunday. So we had 3 groups of songster brigades from the whole territory. It was a great way of getting to know so many people, in that we had one chorus for the Albert Hall Festival, we had another chorus for the Saturday of the July Festival, we had yet another chorus for the Sunday of the July Festival, and RSA and I travelled around and did the rehearsals for that particular event. So we were able to help each other. We spent quite a lot of time in the car chatting to each other. He would play for me at the rehearsals. I would play for him with the ones he was conducting, and Enfield with a duty band on the Saturday evening with Jim Williams, and Norwich with Bob Munn with a duty band on the Sunday. So they were just great guys. But even before that, RSA had been the editor of The Musician at my commissioning. And I'd written some of the pageant music that night, as you do in those days. Some of it had been written by Dick Cromenhook, but I'd written and arranged some of it as well. And the prayer chorus for that night was something that I'd written. You don't have to make it on your own, was the line of the chorus. RSA was so taken with the chorus, he kind of consulted, I think, and decided that it wasn't long enough or a big enough piece to be printed. In a way, it could have done with a verse and a chorus, but because it was just a chorus, he'd checked out and decided that it wouldn't be big enough to warrant perhaps printing in the Musical Salvationist, and so he decided that he would print it in the Musician or the Salvationist magazine, as it was then. So he actually kind of printed my first vocal piece in 1984, I think it came out in that same year, 1984. So he printed that in the Musician. So these guys, these people are kind of just been very encouraging to me in terms of who I was. I didn't kind of pretend to be anything, and there's part of me that looks back at it and I'm sort of a bit surprised by it all, really. But RSA became a really good friend. The third person, and he was also instrumental in helping me, there's a piece in the festival series called Elegiac Variations. I wrote that after we moved to Weymouth. We moved from London and we moved to Weymouth to become the corps officers. Things were a bit difficult, and my musical involvement in the territory was kind of, and this is not judgmental on anybody in any way, but was kind of very much sidelined. And whereas I'd been encouraged to be part of so many things and done so many things, there wasn't a lot happening. And as a musician, I kind of guess I needed that. But the one person who became my mentor and very, very close friend was Brian Burdett. We'd met at the 1990 Congress when the Canadian Staff Band were visitors. They were a fantastic band. I'd gone to Birmingham and we were at the Albert Hall. I'd gone to Birmingham when they were there for a weekend and first met up with Brian. But the last weekend of the 1990 International Congress that Eva Burrows wanted in those days, it was there was a big choral festival at the Albert Hall where we had huge mass songsters on the Saturday night, and the solo band that night was the Canadian Staff Band with Brian. They played one of the pieces they played, I can remember it as if it was yesterday, was the Shostakovich Festive Overture. And when it came to those big bass drum notes in the middle, there, both occasions, on both shows, there were a number of slightly elderly songsters on the front rows because they couldn't climb too far away from the band, who were directly behind the band, who nearly jumped out of their skins every time that particular section of music came. But Jill Bearcroft went up to Brian, and I mean, I knew been introduced to each other then. Jill went up to Brian, and they'd obviously nurtured Brian. He was a founder member of the Canadian Staff Band and known him as quite a young man during their time in Canada. And Jill went up to Brian and said, "There's somebody I want you to meet because he reminds me so much of you." And she made sure, Jill Bearcroft made sure that Brian and I really connected. And
what a lovely thing.
It became a lifelong friendship. Very sadly, Brian passed away just over 2 years ago, and I had the privilege of flying over to Canada and speaking at his funeral eventually, which was extraordinarily sad because he was only 69 and he'd been such a great friend and mentor to me. So with Elegiac Variations, he was the Canadian Staff Bandmaster, and I sent him, when I'd done it and got my first draft of it, I sent him a copy of it, a copy of Set of Parts and Score, and he read it through for me and sent a recording back to me and worked on it that way to get to where it is. There weren't masses of changes, particular changes to some of the figurations in the first movement. I seem to remember were the things that I really had to think about and work through. But so I've always had people in those kind of days that have kind of sort of helped me and nurtured me, given me opportunities. You know, you need that opportunity to hear what's going on and to hear what you've done. Even these days, doing it on computer, there's nothing, you however well you think it works on Sibelius or Dorico or Finale, whatever you think it works like, until you've actually heard it live on the band, you can't be sure as to exactly how it works. But in those days, it was even more scary than that, you know, because it was all in your head, and you had to wait until people were kind enough to help you or do things.
Let me ask you, going back a little bit, I mean, obviously you had this incredible education, and you said you studied piano and done follow-up university. You know, was that kind of, were you looking at a musical career? Because obviously being a Salvation Army officer may not necessarily be that, may just be evangelizing the gospel in call work. So what was the plan? Was it to be a musical sort of education, to become a member of an orchestra or whatever, and then the call came?
I was training to be a pianist. I was training to be a pianist. I got onto that's why I went and did postgraduate piano at the Royal Northern College of Music. I was with a Russian teacher she's 91, and it's probably time I gave her a ring again just to see how she's doing. Lady by the name of Sulamita Aronovsky, a brilliant Russian teacher and pianist. She came over to this country in the early 70s, and I became one of her students in 1979 at the Royal Northern College of Music, and I was training to be a pianist. I was doing recitals. I'd been accepted. I was doing auditions for different things. I'd been accepted on the Yehudi Menuhin Live Music Now program. I went and did, I can remember in my second year at the Royal Northern, I went to kind of at least half a dozen different places doing kind of recitals for music clubs, you know, and starting to earn a little bit of money for playing the piano. One of the students that was in the Aronofsky stable in those days was Ashkenazi Jr. And I was supposed to be going back to Manchester for a third year to do the professional performers course. We'd actually got in the college program, we'd got an engagement to do the Bartók Sonata for two pianos and percussion, which I'd already half learnt before I left college, before I went home for the summer break that year. I'd also learnt in the 6 weeks before we'd finished, I'd also learnt the Liszt first piano concerto and had done a couple of auditions for that. And we were kind of negotiating the possibility to do the Liszt piano concerto with the Liverpool Philharmonic. So that was all kind of happening and in the pipeline. Having said that, for quite some time, I'd remained as a student, I'd remained a committed Salvationist, and I went to Cobham Music School that summer, And it was kind of after Cobham that year that I decided that it's really hard. Your instincts, your motivation, your calling, it's so hard to put into words
Hmm.
how you describe it. But I just came to the conclusion that the right thing for me to do and the right direction for my life was to become a Salvation Army officer. That's how I ended up then, instead of going back to Manchester, I ended up talking to Jill and Norman, seeing Norman, ended up working in the bands department, and earning some money so I'd got a bit behind me, having been a student for 5 years, to go into the training college. So that all was a natural, very natural part of life that seemed to be, I never felt as though I was giving up anything. I always felt that was just the natural path
Yeah.
that my life needed to take. And that's the way it went. I'm always grateful that I did that. I hope and I think that I'm a far better, more rounded person than if I'd just been a musician. Some of the things I did as part of my training, some of the skills, some of the interpersonal skills that I was able to kind of, take on board as part of some of the things that I did in those days. I think and I hope that I'm just a far better person for who I am these days because of all those experiences. My relationship with the piano was very good. my relationship with people was probably a little bit more socially inept and not quite so easy, and that was kind of partly my character as well. So it's part and parcel of who I am these days, and it's just that huge, rich tapestry of all those threads that go together to kind of make you who you are.
Yeah. I said at the beginning, I looked through my list to see what credits I had in your name, and I found one I didn't realise, and I hadn't listened to it for a while, so I deliberately listened to it this morning and was really enjoying Joy Through the Ages, which I thoroughly enjoyed because it's a lovely arrangement. But you've done you wrote Starlights, which I absolutely adore listening to because it's a lovely little bright sparky piece. And it's kind of a cornet trio, but you don't really get cornet trio. You get duets and the solos, but a cornet trio it seems to be a rarity these days. I mean, it was 1993 it's being published, but what do you remember about the genesis of Starlights and how it came to be written?
That was written, I'm pretty sure that was written for one of the Albert Hall festivals. I think that was one of those things that was written for one of the Albert Hall festivals when Norman said, we need something like this on the program. And that's where sometimes, I mean, a lot of the things that I've done have been things that have been done for specific events that sometimes, I think, I forget who it was, I forget what band it was, I've got it somewhere. I could have looked it up, but and if I looked at my score, if I looked at my original manuscript, which I've still got all my original manuscripts. I could tell you exactly when it was done, but it was done for an Albert. It was done for an Albert Hall event with kind of with a few bands with all the cornet players, top 3 cornet players from each band stood at the front. It might have even been. No, I don't think it was the 1990 Congress, but it was done for either 1991 or 1992.
National School of Music in 1990.
Right. Okay.
According to the score notes are available on the Salvation Army Music Index.
Right.
The follow-up with the score.
That's it.
Music in 1990.
National School of Music. That's right. Now you say that, I remember that. I remember doing that it was for Cobham. It was originally done for Cobham, and I think later on it was used at an Albert Hall event. And I think it was done because we needed something like that. Norman probably wanted something like that for the massed event, and I ended up coming up with that kind of. It is quite a nice. You end up being so divorced from your pieces this long way off it's kind of, it is kind of quite a nice little sparkly number.
Yeah, I think what has come through for me from doing these interviews is I'd be hard pressed to think of a composer that says they love to do functional pieces because they know they're going to get used. As,
Yeah.
as you've alluded to, you know, there's something really grand and wonderful about writing a Royal Albert Hall concert piece for the yearly festival, but at the end of the day, it's almost kind of specifically designed for that. Unless you have the Canadian Staff Band or the Melbourne Staff Band do it, it sort of sits on the shelf. It kind of, it's kind of spoiled in a way because, you know, there's a lot of time and effort went into that. And although it was wonderful because it was specifically designed, and yet you look at Starlight's Miracles of Grace, and I haven't been able to trace Southend Salute, even though I know Southend very well. I haven't been able to trace the recording of it. It's just that it's that simple functional thing where it can be done for a very simple occasion. It doesn't have to be a grand concert. As a, you know, as a musician, that's something you enjoy as a musician, doing these functional pieces because you know they're going to get used?
Well, yeah, I mean, I enjoy doing both things. Sometimes what happens when you're asked to do something, that ends up as being the spur to make you sit down and get on with it. I mean, life these days, well, not at the moment. Life has always been very busy in terms of kind of earning my living as a piano tutor, doing some of the piano work that I do, working as an ABRSM examiner, the years that I've looked after Boscombe and all the brass band conducting that I've done, the years that I was in Amsterdam and worked with them.
You were Amsterdam staff bandmaster. Yes.
I was there for 6 years. I was the music secretary and the staff bandmaster, and all of those kind of things means that actually just the time to sit down and write comes at a premium. So sometimes the functional things that you're asked to do are things that actually make you sit down and get on with it. Even last year, I've got a number of other things that, I mean, I've still got quite a lot of stuff in manuscript. I've done a lot of arrangements, song arrangements that I've done for Boscombe that have been done for specific events or just for congregational use. There's a number of things in that way. And you end up doing those things because they do end up being useful for a certain purpose.
Yeah.
But even last year, I got asked by Stephen Mead. I'd done, for the recording that Boscombe did with him a number of years ago called Locomotion, I'd done the euphonium solo version of When He Cometh for Stephen on the CD Locomotion with Boscombe. And Stephen's dad, Rex, lovely man, obviously know Rex extremely well from Boscombe Corps, where Stephen comes from. Stephen and I go back a long way. We were both in the A band at Cobham in 1982. I was on horn, he was on euphonium. But Stephen, because his dad had dementia and things were getting difficult, Stephen wanted a piece written, a euphonium solo written for a CD that he was doing with Brighouse called UFO. In fact, I think I have a copy of the CD set on my desk here. Yeah, and that's.
Oh, very interesting. I love the colours.
Yep, great CD. Stephen had this project. He was recording at the end of June, and he commissioned me to write a euphonium solo for this CD dedicated to his dad. So the obvious thing was to find out what Rex's favourite tune was. Rex's favourite tune was Ascalon.
Ah, lovely tune.
His favourite tune was Ascalon, and I'll be honest, I kind of thought, what am I going to do with Ascalon? Because
it's a
army-wise,
well-known tune, yeah.
Army-wise, you know, immediately comes to mind Robert Redhead's arrangement in Fanfare of Praise. Daystar comes to mind, that beautiful setting of it that RSA has at the beginning of Daystar. There's a lovely general series arrangement that Ralph Pearce has done that I've used with Boscombe quite a few times, just a lovely sort of straightforward hymn setting of it. So my head was kind of sort of spinning, and it was about early April, and Steve phoned me up and said, "How are you getting on?" I said, "Well, when do you need it?" I didn't say anything. I said, "When do you need it by?" So he gave me the deadline for when he needed it, which was kind of early June, I think it was, first or second week of June. And I was going away 5 weeks examining to Portugal. So I had the tune in my head. I took some manuscript paper with me, and while I was in Portugal, no other devices or anything. I did some of the preparatory work, the kind of things that I would do, and had some time to think. And suddenly the inspiration for the way I wanted to frame it, what I wanted to do with the tune, and I ended up calling it Pastoral, My Joy and Crown, which is My Joy and Crown is one of the lines of the song Fairest Lord Jesus. And I gave it a pastoral type of setting with compound time, and 12/8.
Okay.
So that the compound time signature, instead of the straight 4/4, it has a kind of sort of flowing triplet figures to it. So the song is a kind of sort of, if you read the song, there's a pastoral scene to the song, a kind of sort of nature creation scene to the song. So I kind of took that idea and sketched out a number of things. And then when I came home from that trip, I spent a week and a half maybe, going through the ideas that I'd sketched out, looking at the structure of what I wanted to do, finding all the motivic relationships, everything in that solo, all of the figurations, the motives that it starts off with, the accompaniment figures that it starts off with, they're all little figures, little cells that come out of the structure of the tune. And there's a rhapsodic and kind of quickly sort of changing harmonic sort of colors in the middle section. But again, the euphonium solo, the kind of flowing euphonium solo lines that come out of that, they all come out of lines that I developed out of the tune. So it's kind of quite integrated. And so it's about 6.5 minutes. And I ended up completing that in time for Stephen to take that to rehearsals with Brighouse and to record at the end of June last year, and that came out in November. Again, that one was another one where, until I first heard the first edits in the October, in the June, I did print up, before I'd quite completed, I printed up a set of parts and took it along to Boscombe rehearsal and just ran it down once, and I was pretty sure everything was going to be okay, and it was voiced. There were a couple of sections that I wanted to check because of the voicing and the balance, the integral voicing and the balance. I needed to make sure that that was right, and I was pretty sure it was okay. But again, until I heard the first edits, I didn't know how it worked. All I know is that when Steve heard it and played it through for the first time with the band, it kind of, he was absolutely lovely about it. And so, trust his judgment that it was exactly the right thing.
I mean, obviously, when you're being asked to write music, and particularly solos, there's a theme or a tune. But so, I mean, I was thinking this afternoon when I was listening to some solos that they seem to fall into, and maybe this is just my weird way of thinking, that particularly like cornet solos and euphonium solos and trombone solos, it's a case of you get the tune, but it's also a case of, do you sling in how a lot of triple tonguing and a lot of fancy fireworks in the solo, depending on if it's that kind of thing, because if it's a prayer one or a meditational, obviously that's not needed. But how far in a solo is it a case of utilizing the tune to emphasize the instrument and hang on, let's give them something to prove their mettle as a soloist?
Well, that's always the balance that you're trying to work through. I mean, with the solo that I wrote for Stephen, there was nothing about trying to be clever about what I was trying to do with what I was asking him to play, although it's very demanding range-wise, and a couple of times it goes up to high E flat, which for lots of euphonium players isn't a problem these days anyway. But I wasn't using the extremes of the range for the sake of using the extremes of the range. I was using the extremes of the range for the voicing and the colour and the intensity of sound that it gives you. So, I mean, for me, those kind of things, and I'm honestly never writing for the sake of writing something, or writing something difficult, or writing something because it needs to be done that way. For me, it's always the musical reasons for putting something in, and why you do some of those things, and why it's in there. I tend to be kind of quite focused in terms of where I'm going with some of those kind of things, and exactly what's happening.
So what I mean, obviously, I mean, you have a really eclectic education to draw on when you're writing. What is your process for, you've got the deadline, you know the tune, you know the format. Do you kind of have to lock yourself away and switch off the radio and the Wi-Fi and just get it started, and so you're not blitzed by all the different musical bits? Or has your training enabled you to sort of be sensible and sort of marshal yourself, so if you've got to do a euphonium solo, you can sit down and, okay, let's get on with it, and I know not to listen to the radio and, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook?
No, sometimes it's never quite as clear cut as that. And this is the incredible thing. I mean, like Stephen's solo, when I ended up hearing it for the first time and hearing it on the CD, I'm kind of gobsmacked, and I say to myself, where did all that come from? Now, the kind of inspiration of it first, sometimes you just end up thinking about these things. I've been asked to do something else recently, another euphonium solo. And I've been given some ideas and a sort of background and a bit of a song that would be a theme to it. At the moment, it just occupies my consciousness. And sometimes you suddenly get an idea and something clicks, and I've got a file full of sketches and ideas that haven't been realized, and things to work on. I've got.
You got a mobile phone full of voice
Sometimes, yeah. When I was traveling up and down to Manchester and was in charge of the performance aspects at Salford University, I would often end up thinking about something, and would often just have to tap the voice message and give myself a voice message as to an idea that just, even academically, for some of the things, for some of the teaching things, repertoire things, some of these things you just kind of mull them over. There is the hard work, and I always go through a process. I have certain things that I do. I have certain sketches that I work through. It's what I did when I worked elegiac variations. I create a note row of what's actually happening with the tune without any rhythmic time frame to it. And out of that note row, you're kind of, sometimes there are ideas. So in elegiac variations, everything in elegiac variations, there are intervals and thematic bits and motifs that come out of the tune. Everything is derived from the tune in some way or another. And even the other things that I do in the solos, the other things that I've written, I tend to work those kind of things and work those elements into the composition. The structure is sometimes a little bit more difficult. Sometimes you have to decide the structure. You kind of know what you want, or the structure evolves, or you end up with knowing what you want to do at the end, and you end up then having to decide how you're going to get there. And some of it is experimentation in terms of, like with Stephen's solos, some of it, sometimes I work away from the piano. Sometimes I sit and sketch at the piano. I check out certain harmonic progressions to see if that's what I want to use. I'll sit and check those out at the piano. And then I always sketch out. Most of my compositions are normally sketched out in some way or another, on, depending on how long they are, 6 or 7 pieces of manuscript, 3 lines. Sometimes it's shorthand that only I can read, but 3 lines with either melodic, harmonic structures, bass structures, all the different elements, counter melodies, bits and pieces. And sometimes it's like a jigsaw that you end up putting together to get the right piece. And I never write on Sibelius. I always compose, and all my works are generally formed on the manuscript before I sit down on Sibelius, and then try and realise the scoring. That's how it works for me.
Yeah, because you come from the background where you've had the ability to study a lot of music scores over the years of all different styles, so that will help you sort of formulate how it's going to work and the pattern, and to make sure that, as Will Hunter, the correct grammar is being used.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you find you have to go back to what you've sketched out because it doesn't quite work, and you've got to go and rework it, and that's the whole crafting process that kind of goes on. There's a crafting process that goes on whereby you work through the process of what you're doing to try and sort of come up with the finished composition in terms of when it's done.
Where's the weirdest place you've ever had a message or a text about a piece of music of yours being played?
Say that again. What's the?
We've had in this day and age, the music is not really restricted to the UK. So where's the most unusual place you've ever had a message saying, we played your such and such at the training college, or in the orchestra? What's the most surprising place you've ever heard of a piece of music of yours being played?
I think the most unexpected one that I ever had was from a contesting band in Australia, who I think, if I've got it right, had used elegiac variations as their test piece.
Why not?
Why not?
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. I just say, Chassidic Dance is the one I was thinking of, because I couldn't trace a recording for elegiac variations, but I'm sure there's one out there somewhere.
There's quite a few. I mean, it's on it. Well, you'll find it on quite a few. It's on the Albert Hall DVD from 2005.
I'll see if someone can lend me a
You
copy.
you should find that online somewhere. In fact, I saw it just a few weeks. I don't know. I saw something from that event? It was when I brought Amsterdam Staff Band over in 2005, and we came on tour and went to the Albert Hall. And Chassidic Dance was one of the pieces we played that night. I've used it with Boscom on quite a few occasions. I think it's on. It might be on an Amsterdam Staff Band recording as well somewhere. It's actually on an ISB recording that was done when they were on tour in America quite a few years ago. Steve used it with the staff band on.
I do love Chassidic Dance. It's a very right number.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to try and chase the elegiac variations, because it's not in my repertoire yet, and I've got to sit down and have a listen to that.
The elegiac variations is on my first CD that I did with Amsterdam Staff Band, called Exaltation. And it's I think it's 2001. It was the first. I started there 2000, and I think we're recording in 2001. And Elegiac Variations is on CD. It's got a little rainbow on the front of it. CD called Exaltation. So there's a London Citadel band with John Lamb, who's now the staff bandmaster. John did a recording of it as well at some point, and I think there's also a German staff band recording of it somewhere.
So when you're not doing the music part, is there time for any other interests in your life? Dog walking, painting, Scott, what else is there apart from the musical aspects?
There's loads of music. When I'm home, and I've obviously been home my last day of work, because all the things I do have just completely stopped. ABRSM examining came to a halt. I did my last day of examining. I had quite a few more weeks' work lined up before Easter. I did my last day of examining on March the 17th, and I haven't had a day's work since March the 17th. Obviously, all the band conducting has completely gone out the window. Even this week, I had more cancellations for stuff that hadn't yet been cancelled, but I'd got work. In fact, it was outdoor work that I wondered whether it might have gone ahead, but I had outdoor work, conducting work for the end of September that's just been cancelled this week. I'd got adjudication work. I was supposed to be adjudicating at Brassing Concert in November. That's all gone. So it's very strange days. But the things that I have had time to do lots of other things. I haven't sat down and done the writing that I want to do yet. That's because one of the things that I have done, it's partly because of doing things like this. I've done quite a bit of playing. I've done quite a bit of accompanying work for the Cobham. I've done some accompaniments for the Cobham group. I've been doing quite a few solo accompaniments for Susan Turner. I've done for one or two other people. Stephen and I did a recording of When He Cometh. I did a piano version of the band accompaniment to When He Cometh that Stephen put out. So I've done quite a bit of that. I have thoroughly enjoyed getting my fingers in shape and working and doing piano work, which is what I tend to do of an evening. And then, but the other things, like today, has been an absolutely lovely day. I've still had one or two bits of business, trying to kind of been negotiating and in touch with bits of work, possibly for later on in the year, beginning of January, keeping on top of some of the practical things that you have to do. And so this morning I was kind of working, answering emails, keeping in touch with folks. This afternoon, I have loved spending about 3 hours in my garden. My garden has never looked so good.
Yes.
We have a huge garden. We're lucky that we've got a huge garden where we live here. I normally, I'd blitz something for a couple of days and then I'd be away for a few weeks and not have a chance to do anything. And the area that you've done either needs doing again or you have to start another area. But I've gradually worked through it. I did have a bit of a break because I had an emergency hospitalization 4 weeks ago. But I'm absolutely fine. That's all worked out extremely well. I'm extremely well, and I've spent 3 hours cutting down some more hedge stuff and cleaning up one of the borders and just I do actually love getting in the garden. I do wear gloves to protect my hands, but I've been out there this afternoon, and I'm lucky in that my wife is a palliative nurse. Heather, she's been working. She's still working. She's a community nurse, so she's working from home, but still has to go out and do some visits for patients. She's a lead nurse for the area that we live in, so she's got a team of nurses to look after as well. So she's kind of up in sort of attic bedroom that we've got and able to work from up there, so she's out of the way. So one of the other things that I actually love doing is planning and cooking the meals.
And I believe you've also got a new addition to the family.
Well, new addition to the family.
Congratulations on is it a grandson or grandchild?
We have a granddaughter. We are now Nana and Papa. We have a beautiful granddaughter. I know everybody's granddaughters are beautiful, but we have a beautiful granddaughter by the name of Meredith Elizabeth. Her mum is my daughter Sarah. Her dad is Chris. Chris is the corps officer at Wandsworth Corps, and they have a beautiful daughter. She was born 2 weeks ago today, and she is just an absolute darling. She is just really, really lovely. So that's a new experience.
Best of luck.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It's been really interesting to learn the stories. I didn't realise that your musical education was so profound, but it's obviously helped you, because some writers would have said, I didn't have a clue about this, but in some cases, because of your wide variance of knowledge of different musical styles, it all helps to serve the embryonic nature of your music. So what's next in the pipeline musically? I mean, you've got things like what would be the next thing off the compositional stand of Howard Evans?
Who knows? I mean, because I'm looking at the next few months as still being kind of in this particular situation, I just don't know when work is going to resume. It's really hard to know what's going to resume exam-wise for the board as well. So even that, I'm not expecting anything at the moment. So there's a number of projects. There's one or two things. There's a number of things that I've got. There's sketches that I want to realise. I've had another request and got another commission that I've been asked to do. That probably is my first priority to think about. But there's a few things. I've got sketches and things that I do want to realise, and I am kind of looking forward to having a bit of time and just having time to sit down and make some of these things actually come to fruition. I've got to be honest with you, Morgan, I've got so many things that I've got in sketch form that I've got ideas for. I desperately need the kind of impetus. It's not that I haven't got time. It's just that I seem to have so many things going on in life, and it's always, you seem to be working to the next deadline. But I will be working towards some of these things. So who knows? I do need to kind of make sure that it kind of works and gets itself out there. So we'll see what happens. I can't promise, but I know I've got a few things to do.
I think such is the nature of your abilities and expertise. You'll never be short of a commission, because there'll always be people out there who've enjoyed listening to your music, performing your music, and being part of, you know, the various ensembles and bands that you've been a part of. Just out of curiosity, I mean, can you actually remember the first time you were ever asked to conduct a piece of your music? It's a question I do like to ask, because sometimes it's a very memorable thing, like passing your driving test or something.
Yeah.
So, but bearing in mind that you have such this, you know, wide variety of musical training.
Yeah, I mean, it's happened for a long time. I mean, it's just, you know, even like some of the sort of little ditties, some of the things. I mean, even the sessional march that I wrote, I conducted the first rehearsal of that. The cadets bandmaster was Stan Richardson. If you look at your cassette of the Servants of God session, you'll see that Stan Richardson.
I just need to offline when you posted it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Stan's name is on the CD. In fact, Stan used to let me do the rehearsals, and he'd stand up, and because it wasn't quite done for the cadet to stand up in the meetings and conduct the band, but I used to do all the rehearsals, and Stan would generally stand up and conduct the band on the public occasions, but I did most of the rehearsals. So I did a lot of my stuff. I mean, it's really interesting. It's a very strange experience when you hear your music for the first time. Even being the chord bandmaster, I don't know if this explains it, but even being the chord bandmaster at Boscombe and having things sometimes, if I'd got things that I was doing with Boscombe and I'd done something for them, and there were a few times that I did things for some of the, I've got some Christmas pieces and arrangements that we did. I was in China a couple of years ago, and whilst I was in China, I took inspiration off a Sunday morning worship off Radio 4 whilst I was in China, and sketched out a piece that I wrote when I came back, and we played it 2 weeks later at one of the Christmas concerts. But there is always that huge anxiety when you play something with a band or you're conducting something with a band for the first time, because you know, you get a sense from the players, whether they say anything or not, you get a sense from the players as to whether they think it's any good. Now, last summer, I took to TMS a new euphonium solo that Andrew is publishing next year, another euphonium solo. It was something that I'd written for a student at Manchester. And it was to do with when I was ill, and it was like a dialogue. I've called it Soliloquy, and it's a dialogue, and the music is based on George Marshall's song, In the Stillness. And there isn't necessarily a complete version of the song, but the song comes throughout the piece, and it's like a dialogue with a soloist in the accompaniment. I'd done it originally for piano and instrument. I scored it out the day before I went to TMS last year on the Friday. I'd got a completely clear day. All I'd got to do, I'd packed the night before, and I started work first thing on the Friday, and I scored it out and took it with me to TMS. Now, I'd never heard it played before anyway, although I'd tried it out with somebody with me on the piano, but so I'd never tried it. And Andrew was sat helping out on horn in the middle of my TMS band. I explained the background to the work. I explained the piece to these youngsters, and there's a huge anxiety, and I don't think people would understand this. You have this huge anxiety as to how they're going to react and relate to it. The kindest thing from those youngsters was that, yes, I'd taken the trouble to explain it, and we sight read the piece through. And at the end of the music, you could have heard a pin drop. Those youngsters got and understood what I was trying to say. And Andrew and I spoke about that afterwards.
Yeah.
And so you just have this huge sense of relief and this huge kind of sense of humility, and you're just so grateful that people have maybe sometimes understood what you're trying to say through your music. So the whole experience of hearing your music for the first time never stops. And
Yeah.
even last year, that was my kind of experience, and I shall forever be grateful to that TMS band. So Andrew took it away. I think the music went to the music board kind of, I think it got played kind of October, November time, and it's due to be published in the general series April next year. So that's something to look forward to as well.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I think a lot of composers are just, you know, Les Condon famously says on his recording, you know, you okay, that's about as good as it's going to get, but it's not until you hear it in real life. And what
Yep.
a lot of composers that I've spoken to in the course have been really keen on doing is using some of the heritage songs of the Salvation Army rather than what I would have thought would be natural. I mean, Sam Creamer digging back and using Sidney Cox songs and John Gowan songs rather than doing a contemporary Christian thing, because for the funk kind of swing setting, the contemporary Christians would have been a more natural fit rather than take a George Marshall song, and yet they want to dig out all the gems and use all these wonderful, you know, heritage songs. So I think it's a wonderful thing that we've got this heritage and we're not afraid to use it.
Yeah, I mean, it's framed. I mean, I particularly love the King Singers recording of that, and there was a time because I had those 14 months. Not that I was out of action army-wise with Boscombe, but when I was kind of off work, I had 14 months when I went through my cancer treatments with all the chemo that I had, the 2 operations that I had, the radiotherapy, just everything. And there were certain pieces of music that actually kind of kept me grounded during that time. And for a few months during that time, there was that version of the King Singers singing In the Stillness, and that George Marshall song that really kind of, I mean, that's why I ended up using that. And that's where the solo has that sense of dialogue, but that classic song and the words of the chorus in particular, scatter my darkness like breaking of day. That's the line that kind of means the most to me. Come to my heart, Lord, like dew gently falling. Scatter my darkness like breaking of day. There's a prayer in there just to say whatever you need to.
Yeah. And as a conductor of a very famous Salvation Army band down in Boscombe, and with the wide variety of skills you've got there, who are the sort of the modern composers that are coming up through the ranks that you particularly enjoy seeing and thinking, yeah, I can see potential here?
There are so many. I don't know whether he would thank me for calling him young, but Kevin, I think Kevin Larson, Kevin is absolutely super.
Yeah.
Kevin might not thank me for describing him as young, but Kevin was actually in, I mean, sorry about that, Kevin, but Kevin was in my Dauncey's band the last time I was at Territorial Music School in 1991. He was a young student and was in my band in those years, and our paths have crossed a few times since. Kevin's very clever at adapting styles and finding a voice for his compositions. And I mean, I mean, I suppose the trouble is, if I kind of look around and look at some of the youngsters, I mean, there's so many. It's really hard to kind of who comes to me. I mean, there are some gems that have been published over recent years in the general series. I mean, Sam Creamer is one of them. Is writing some lovely stuff. One of the interesting things for me, looking at some of those youngsters, is how they are influenced by some of the older voices. It's very interesting how some of them are influenced by Ken Downey's music and Ken Downey's harmonizations, and those kind of things. I mean, the other people who are obviously stand up. Marcus Venables.
Yep.
Marcus is writing very, very distinctive music in that way. And the other person who's starting just aware of some of the things that he's writing is Joel Collier.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, kind of really, I mean, the other name that I know and the other person that I keep an eye on is Ed Milcreast. Ed was obviously part of the Boscombe band.
Yeah.
I tried to help Ed with some of his early compositions and would read some of his early things with Boscombe when he was at Boscombe and just starting out on that journey. It's a huge learning process. So there's quite a number of folks out there.
Yeah, I share an affinity with Edward because he was born in the same hospital as me. But a few
right, okay.
His parents were at Felixstowe, which is
Right,
just down the road. So I've known Eddie for some time, like his mother, who was part of the Butlin staff for many years. You've alluded to I think you've already mentioned your favourite Salvation Army song. So I'll ask, is there a piece of scripture that you'd put on the fridge magnet if you could? Is there something that really speaks to you, or is it just a case of it?
Yeah, there are two things. I can't just go for the one. One of the things that I often quote is Psalm 91, and which is really a psalm of protection. And there are some beautiful words. I have it kind of on my desk here. On my office desk, I do actually like to keep my songbook on my office desk. Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. And there's a number of verses there. There's also a number of verses. I've used these verses on numerous occasions. The verses that kind of also never cease to amaze me is the prologue to St. John's Gospel, both for what it says and what we understand that it says, but also both for the kind of sort of the mystery of what we don't understand what it says and everything that it says about life. I fell in love with this many, many years ago, and I never tire of reading the prologue to St. John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I love those first 18 verses of St. John's Gospel.
Well, I think it just goes that the Lord continues to speak to us in so many different ways, and the blessings we have, sometimes we just don't know where to start. It's the miracles of grace, to coin a phrase.
Thank you.
I'm going to pray with you now, because I think that's the suitable way it's to end this conversation. But thank you so much for taking time out. And
really kind of you to put up with me and to listen to me rambling on.
No, it's been a real education, because apart from the name and Starlights, Joy Through the Ages, Miracles of Grace, I knew you being a national bandmaster. I knew you being but apart from that, I had no idea. We've met a couple of times, so I know you as a person. But apart from that, I had no idea about your wonderful musical background, and the training and the development of that is so clearly a part of you and has just graced your musical output. And I think that's wonderful. And just thank you so much for being willing to share it with us.
Really kind of you, Morvin. Thank you.
Lockdown. So I'll just say a prayer as you wish, feel comfortable.
Thank you.
Dear Lord, the gift of music and the gift of understanding music is something that I don't think many people will ever scratch the surface on, and we try our humblest to understand the mechanics and just to utilize the talents that we have. And I thank you for Howard. I thank you that you have bestowed on him this incredible knowledge, and that he is so willing to use what he can and has been blessed by his phenomenal education output of his early life and his family, and that willingness just to get involved in so many different phrases and orchestras and experiences, and opportunities, Lord. Some people could only dream of it. So we thank you for those opportunities, Lord. We thank you that they have helped shape him and his family into what they are now, and they can serve you richly because of that foundation, Lord. It makes us who we are. We thank you for his experiences, his faith, his willingness to follow you. We thank you that this wonderful gift of composition he has taken hold of, and he just tries to do his very best, Lord, and knowing that when it doesn't work and when something's not clicking, that you will provide the answer. You will provide the peace and the serenity. We think of those wonderful names of Ray Stevenson and Ray Bowes, the legend that was Eric Bull, that helped him in his early years. And I thank you for that, Lord, that those names live on because they were truly just trying to serve you. So I just thank you, Lord, for his compositional gifts, his willingness to sit down and exercise the grey matter. So somebody will go, do you know what? That was what we needed for the family. That was the healing. That was the laughter. That was the joy. We sometimes have no idea what the end result will be. We just do what we can, Lord. And I thank you for Howard's willingness to do that, to accept the challenge, to try and create something original. Many composers have said the hardest thing is that blank sheet of paper, and that you alone, Lord, are the one that gives the impetus to kick the compositional bottom and get started. And at the end of the day, bless the work that is made in your name. To God be the glory, great things that you have done. So we thank you for Howard, we thank you for his family, we pray for them, especially now with the new edition and all the challenges and the joy of new life. You came to give us life. And we thank you for the new grandchild and for the experiences, and that when this lockdown will ease, that the family will be able to come together once more and just enjoy that family time, as we know many families are suffering. We pray for that, Lord. We know that you are there to be prayed to and to ask help from. And we thank you for the compositions and the music and the comrades and the Boscoms and the music schools and the orchestras and all the people that come into contact with Howard, and who Howard comes into contact with, that they will receive the reassurance and the blessing and the comfort that sometimes is needed. We just thank you for that. We thank you for his Christianity, his faith, and his willingness to keep following you, and to know that you are in the center of everything he does, and that you are the rock on which he stands. And we thank you for that. We thank you for that reassurance, that blessed assurance. So I just want to place him and his family and his grandchild in your care, Lord, and ask that you bless them, look after them, give them the guidance, the strength, the empowerment, and the sense of calm in this frantic world at the moment. But we thank you, Lord, for all this. And I just pray, Lord, your blessing on him now. Amen.
Amen. Bless you. Thank you.
I will